What would you do if the only thing you could afford in the world was a ghost? If, left with nothing but $3 and the dust of a forgotten road, you bought the one property everyone knew was worthless? For 18-year-old Willa Braun, this wasn't a question. In the damp Oregon autumn of 1888, she traded every cent she had for the deed to an abandoned stagecoach station, a collapsing ruin swallowed by the Cascade forests. But the truth waiting inside those rotting walls was more valuable than any timber claim or gold mine, a secret buried for years that would rewrite the history of the valley and give a voice back to the silenced. This is a story about the quiet power of refusal. The refusal to be forgotten, the refusal to let a good thing die, and the refusal to believe something is worthless just because the world has told you so. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we journey back to a forgotten corner of the frontier, where a young woman's grief would unearth a generation's hope. The air in Farewell, Oregon, tasted of sawdust and endings. Willa Braun stood on the splintered boardwalk, her hands clenched inside the pockets of a threadbare coat, and watched the Miller family's wagon shrink against the vast, indifferent horizon. It didn't kick up much dust. The roads were already damp with the coming rains. A finality settled in her bones, cold and heavy as riverstone. They hadn't been cruel, the Millers. They had taken her in 6 years ago, after the fever took the last of her known kin. They had given her a cot, chores, and a thin, consistent silence. But they were heading east, back to a place they called home, and there was no room in the wagon or their plans for a girl who was not quite daughter and no longer child. Mrs. Miller had pressed 3 worn dollar coins into her palm that morning. "You're a sensible girl, Willa," she'd said, her eyes fixed on a loose thread on her husband's coat. "You'll make your way." It wasn't a blessing. It was a release. Now, at 18, Willa was adrift. She was a ghost in a town that had only ever seen her as a shadow in someone else's house. She had no family name that mattered, no inheritance waiting, no one to ask after her. She owned the clothes on her back, a small canvas satchel with a spare shirt and a block of soap, and the $3 in her hand. A memory, sharp and sudden as a splinter, surfaced. Her own mother, a woman she recalled only in fleeting images of firelight and the scent of baked bread, humming a tune Willa could never quite catch. Her father was even less, a shape in a doorway, the feel of a rough wool coat. They were gone. The Millers were gone. She was all that was left of herself. The weight of that aloneness was a physical thing, pressing on her shoulders, making it hard to draw a full breath. She could try to find work as a laundress, a mender, a scullery maid. She could become another worn-out woman in a town full of them, her hands raw and her future shrinking with every passing year. Or she could do something else. The thought was a flicker, a tiny spark in the vast grayness of her prospects. She turned away from the empty road and walked toward the one place in town that dealt in futures, however small, the territorial land office. The bell above the door gave a weak, tinny jingle, announcing an arrival no one had been expecting. The air inside was stale with the smell of old paper, ink, and cigar smoke. A pot-bellied clerk with a sweat-sheened brow, Mr. Finch, glanced up from his ledger, his expression one of bored irritation. "What is it, girl?" he asked, his pen not pausing its scratchy journey across the page. Willa's throat was dry. She placed her $3 on the polished wood of the counter. They looked impossibly small, an offering to a god who wasn't listening. "I want to buy land," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't tremble. Behind her, A low chuckle rumbled through the room. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. Silas Croft, a man who seemed to be made of lard and ambition, was leaning against the far wall, a thick cigarillo clamped in his teeth. He bought and sold timber claims, foreclosed on homesteads, and moved through the territory like a slow, consuming blight. "Hear that, Finch?" Croft boomed. "The girl wants to buy land. Perhaps a nice parcel on the moon?" Finch allowed himself a thin, greasy smile. "We don't trade in charity here," he said to Willa, his eyes flicking from her worn boots to her patched coat. "What you have there might buy you a meal, not a future." Willa's gaze didn't waver. "Is there anything at all? A forgotten claim? Something reverted?" Finch sighed, enjoying the theater of it. He ran a thick finger down a list of abandoned and tax-defaulted properties. "There's nothing here for you," he began, but then he stopped. A slow, cruel grin spread across his face. "Well now, there is one thing." He tapped the page. "The old Hollow Creek relay station, on the abandoned government route. 20 acres of poison oak and rock, and a building that's more hole than roof. Been on the books for a decade. No one wants it. The deed's worthless." He looked at Croft, then back at her. "But the paperwork costs $3 to file." It was a joke, a piece of sport for a slow afternoon. They were mocking her poverty, her audacity. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, a flush of shame and anger. She could snatch her money back, turn and run. But where would she run to? Another town, another street, another door closed in her face? She looked at the smirking faces of the two men, and a cold, hard stubbornness took root in her heart. They saw a worthless girl buying a worthless deed. She saw a roof. Maybe. "I'll take it," she said. The words hung in the still air. Croft let out a full-throated laugh. "By God, she'll take it!" Finch shook his head, still smiling, as he began to fill out the paperwork. He took her $3. He slid the deed across the counter. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt heavy in her hand, the heaviest thing she had ever owned. She folded it carefully and put it in her satchel, turned without a word, and walked out, the sound of their laughter following her into the street. She had a place. It was a ruin, a joke, a ghost of a building on a dead road. But it was hers. Is this the act of a desperate fool, or the first step toward an unimaginable discovery? What secret could a place so thoroughly forgotten possibly hold? Let us know what you think she'll find in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden history. Now, with the deed in her pocket and the town's scorn at her back, Willa had to get there. Willa's first stop was the livery, a sprawling barn that smelled richly of hay, horse, and leather. Here, at least, she did not feel like a ghost. Elias Thorne, the liveryman, was a gnarled old fellow with kind eyes and a face as cracked and weathered as old harness. He had known her father, back when her father was a logger with strong arms and a ready laugh, before the accident that had stolen him and the sickness that had taken her mother. Elias never looked at her with pity, only a quiet, steady recognition. He was brushing down a handsome bay when she entered. He paused, leaning the brush against the stall. "Willa," he said. It was a greeting and a question in one. In the last stall, a sway-backed old mare with a coat the color of road dust nickered softly. Dust. She was the miller's oldest horse, deemed not worth the feed to haul her east. They had left her with Elias to sell for glue, if he could. Willa's heart ached to look at her. "They left her," Willa said, her voice low. "I know," Elias replied. He looked from Willa's determined face to the mare's tired one. "What's your plan, child?" She pulled the deed from her satchel and let him read it. He pursed his lips, his gaze thoughtful. He didn't laugh. He handed it back to her, his thumb brushing over the official seal. "Hollow Creek, that's a hard place. Lonely." "It's what I have," she said. He nodded slowly. "A person needs a place." He walked over to Dust's stall and opened the gate. The old mare ambled out, nudging Willa's shoulder with her soft nose. "She's not worth $5 on her best day," Elias said. "But a person also needs a partner. She's yours. No charge." He then pointed to a corner of the barn where a collection of worn but serviceable tools leaned against the wall. "Take the axe and the saw. And this." He handed her a heavy, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was a hammer, a box of nails, a length of rope, and a small sack of dried beans and hardtack. Willa felt a knot tighten in her throat. "Elias, I can't." "You can," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your father was a good man. He'd have done the same." An hour later, Willa was riding out of farewell, the old mare's gait slow but steady beneath her. The weight of the tools was a comfort, a tangible promise of work to be done. The townspeople watched her go from behind curtains and over shop counters. Their whispers followed her like a cloud of gnats. The orphan girl buying the ruin, riding a glue horse into the wilderness. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight. Let them talk. On the very edge of town, where the last scrappy homesteads gave way to thick timber, an old woman sat on a log, weaving a basket from cedar bark. She was Wasco, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. As Willa rode past, the woman looked up, her hands never ceasing their intricate work. Her gaze was not unkind, nor was it curious. It was ancient. "The ground remembers," the old woman said, her voice dry as autumn leaves. "It remembers what paper forgets." The words were strange, settling in Willa's mind like a smooth, peculiar stone. She didn't know what they meant, but she nodded in respect. The woman gave a slight dip of her head and returned to her weaving. Willa urged Dust onward, leaving the last vestige of farewell behind. The trail into the mountains was little more than a deer path now, choked with ferns and salal. The deeper she went, the more the world of men fell away, replaced by the hushed, breathing presence of the forest. The laughter of Silas Croft and the whispers of the town faded, and all that was left was the creak of old leather, the soft plod of Dust's hooves, and a cryptic phrase that echoed in the silence. The journey to Hollow Creek took the rest of the day. The trail climbed steadily, winding through groves of towering fir and hemlock, whose tops were lost in the low, gray clouds. The air grew cooler, thick with the smell of damp earth and moss. Green was everywhere, 100 shades of it, clinging to bark, carpeting the ground, dripping from ferns that crowded the path. It was beautiful, but in a way that felt ancient and unwelcoming, as if the forest was patiently waiting to swallow up anything that dared to stop moving. By late afternoon, the light began to fail, turning the woods into a maze of deep shadows and gray twilight. Dust was flagging, her head low, her breath coming in tired puffs. Willa was sore and chilled to the bone, a gnawing unease settling in her stomach. What if Elias was wrong? What if it wasn't just a ruin, but a trap, a place from which there was no return? Just as true despair began to set in, the trail widened slightly and dipped into a shallow ravine. And there it was, the Hollow Creek relay station. It was worse than she had imagined. The main building sagged in the middle, its spine broken. The roof was a lattice of bare timbers and gaping holes, patched here and there with moss and ferns. The windows were vacant eyes, their glass long gone. A porch ran the length of the front, but half of it had collapsed into a tangle of splintered, rotting wood. The stables nearby were even worse, a mere skeleton of a building slowly returning to the earth. The only sound was the steady drip, drip, drip of water from the eaves and the sigh of the wind through the pines. Nature had not just reclaimed this place, it had devoured it. A wave of profound disappointment washed over Willa, so sharp it felt like a physical blow. The clerk's laughter echoed in her ears. This wasn't a home. It was a grave. She slid off Dust's back, her legs stiff and shaky. The old mare let out a long, weary sigh, as if sharing her rider's despair. For a long moment, Willa just stood there, taking in the scale of the dereliction. This was her $3. This was her future. A pile of wet, rotting wood in the middle of nowhere. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and shameful. She would not cry. Crying was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Instead, she took the axe from her saddle. There was a small, semi-intact overhang near what might have been the main door. With grim determination, she spent the last of the daylight clearing the debris from underneath it and hacking away the wettest, most rotten boards. She tethered Dust nearby, giving her the last of the oats the millers had left her. As darkness fell, complete and suffocating, Willa huddled under the meager shelter, her coat pulled tight, the sack of beans for a pillow. The cold seeped up from the ground, and the forest came alive with the rustles and snaps of unseen things. She was cold, hungry, and utterly alone, the proud owner of a ruin. She had never felt so foolish or so lost. But as she drifted into an exhausted sleep, a single thought persisted. It was hers, and tomorrow the work would begin. What could one girl with an axe possibly do to fight back such decay? The first day was a battle of inches. Willa woke stiff and cold to a world shrouded in mist. The station looked even more hopeless in the flat, gray light of dawn, but the despair of the previous night had cooled into a hard, quiet resolve. She would not be beaten by rot and rain. She ate a piece of hardtack, saving the beans for later, and got to work. Her first priority was a space for herself and Dust, a place to be dry. The main building was too far gone to tackle all at once, so she focused on the most promising section. A corner room that still had 3.5 walls and a portion of intact roof. She spent the entire morning with the axe and saw, clearing fallen timbers, prying away rotten floorboards, and tearing down the collapsed section of the porch for salvageable wood. The work was brutal. Her hands, softened by years of mending and kitchen work, were quickly blistered, then rubbed raw. Her back and shoulders screamed in protest. But with every swing of the axe, a piece of her fear and helplessness fell away, replaced by the satisfying bite of steel into wood. She was not just clearing debris, she was imposing her will on the chaos. By midday, she had a small, cleared space. Using nails from Elias's bundle, she began patching the largest holes in the wall with planks salvaged from the porch. The boards were old and weathered, but most were still sound. It was clumsy work, but slowly a solid barrier against the wind began to take shape. Dust watched her from her tether, occasionally flicking an ear or letting out a soft sigh, a silent, steady witness to the struggle. That afternoon, she turned her attention to the inside. The floor was a mess of dirt, animal droppings, and sodden leaves, but beneath the filth was packed earth, hard and level. She swept it as clean as she could with a makeshift broom of fir boughs. Then she turned to the most daunting task inside the room, the root cellar. It was a dark square cut into the floor, its ladder long since rotted away. A foul, stagnant smell rose from the opening. It was likely flooded, a pit of decay. But if she was to live here, she couldn't have a swamp festering beneath her floor. She needed to clean it out. She used the rope Elias had given her to lower herself into the darkness. Her boots sank into a foot of cold, slimy water and muck. The smell was overwhelming. Rot and wet earth and something else. Something metallic and sour. Using a bucket fashioned from a rotted cask, she began the disgusting work of bailing. Bucket by bucket, she hauled up the stinking water and dumped it outside. It was endless, spirit-crushing labor. As the water level slowly dropped, the contents of the cellar were revealed. Broken shelves, shattered crocks, and a thick layer of black, putrid sludge. She shoveled the sludge into the bucket, her muscles burning, her whole body slick with filth. It was in the last corner, scraping the shovel against the stone floor to get the final layer of muck, that she heard it. Not the scrape of steel on rough, uneven rock. It was a clean, sharp clink. She stopped, listening. She scraped again. Clink. It was a different sound, a sound of impact against something flat, something dressed. Curious, she cleared the last of the slime away with her hands. There, in the corner, was a flagstone. But unlike the other rough, irregular stones that made up the cellar floor, this one was perfectly square, its edges straight and true. It didn't belong. It was too precise, too deliberate, an anomaly. For a moment, she just stared at it, a flicker of curiosity cutting through her exhaustion. But the light was failing again, and she was bone-weary and filthy. It was just a strange stone. She would deal with it later. She climbed out of the cellar, covered the opening with a few solid planks, and collapsed into her bedroll in the corner of her newly won room. The odd, clean sound of metal on stone echoing faintly in her mind. A week passed. The rhythm of survival took over, pushing the memory of the strange flagstone to the back of her mind. Each day was a litany of labor. Willa patched more of the roof, using strips of bark and salvaged planks, creating a small, mostly dry haven in the corner of the ruin. She cleared a space in the skeletal stables for dust, giving the old mare a shield from the worst of the wind and rain. She found a small, clear spring a few hundred yards up the creek, providing clean water. She learned the language of the forest. The sharp cry of a hawk meant clear skies. The frantic chatter of squirrels predicted a storm. Her hands hardened, the blisters turning to calluses. The thin, uncertain girl who had arrived a week ago was being burned away, leaving someone tougher, leaner, more weathered. She was becoming a part of the place, her sweat and labor seeping into the very wood and soil. But the cellar remained, a dark question mark in the center of her small world. Every time she walked over the planks covering its entrance, she thought of the perfectly square stone. It was a note out of tune in the song of the ruin. Everything else was chaos, decay, the slow, indifferent work of nature. That stone was the opposite. It was order. It was intention. On the 8th day, a steady, miserable drizzle set in, making outside work impossible. She was confined to her small, dry corner, the sound of the rain a constant drumming on the patched roof. The silence and the confinement brought the cellar back to the forefront of her thoughts. She had Elias's tools. She had time. There were no more excuses. Taking a deep breath, she pulled the planks away from the opening. The damp, earthy smell rose to meet her. The water had not returned. Her bailing had held. She lowered herself down the rope, a lantern in one hand, Elias's pry bar in the other. The lantern cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. She made her way to the corner and knelt, the light glinting off the damp surface of the square flagstone. It was about 2 feet by 2 feet, its surface smoother than the surrounding rock. The seams around it were filled with dirt, but they were unnervingly straight. She took the tip of a knife and scraped one of the seams clean. It was a perfect, deliberate gap, not a natural crack. Someone had placed this here. Using the sharp end of the pry bar, she worked it into the seam and pushed. Nothing. She put her shoulder into it, grunting with the effort. The stone was immense, set deep. She repositioned the bar, finding a better angle, and threw her entire weight against it. A faint grinding sound, a crack of movement. Hope surged through her. She worked the bar back and forth slowly, painstakingly widening the gap. Finally, she was able to get the hooked end of the bar underneath the edge of the stone. She took a deep, steadying breath, planted her feet, and pulled. The stone lifted with a great groaning scrape, heavier than anything she had ever lifted. She heaved it up and over, letting it fall to the floor with a heavy thud. She leaned against the wall, panting, her heart hammering. She held the lantern over the hole. She had expected to see dark earth. She saw wood, perfectly fitted, dark-stained wooden planking, a false floor. The air that rose from the cracks between the boards was different. It wasn't the smell of damp earth and rot. It was dry, still, and ancient, tinged with the faint, ghostly scents of canvas, oil, and old paper. A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold, traced its way down her spine. The laughter of the men in the land office seemed a world away now. This place wasn't empty. It was hiding something. She set the lantern down carefully, its golden light pooling on the dark wood. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the pry bar again. The planks were nailed down tight. She found a seam and forced the tip of the bar into it, levering it up. The wood groaned, and an old square nail screeched in protest as it was pulled from its home of decades. She worked her way down the plank, prying it up inch by inch until it came free in her hands. She tossed it aside and peered into the darkness below. It was a void, a black square of absolute nothingness. The smell was stronger now, a scent of things carefully stored and long forgotten. Kneeling on the cold stone, she lowered the lantern into the opening. The light descended, pushing back the shadows, and revealed the contents of the hidden space. It wasn't a treasure chest filled with gold coins. It was something far more mundane and far more mysterious. The lantern light fell upon the top of a canvas-wrapped crate. Next to it was another and another, and beside them, slumped like sleeping bodies, were several large, stiff sacks made of heavy leather, old U.S. mail sacks. Her breath caught in her throat. This was not a settler's private cache. This was official. This was government property. A deep, instinctual caution washed over her. Whatever this was, it was dangerous. The man who had hidden it had done so for a powerful reason. But the curiosity, the need to know, was stronger than the fear. One by one, with trembling muscles, she began the arduous process of hauling the contents up into the cellar. The crates were heavy, bound with iron straps. The mail sacks were stiff and awkward. It took her nearly an hour to get everything out of the hole and onto the main cellar floor. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, surrounded by the ghosts of a long-dead enterprise. She decided to start with the mail. She chose the smallest sack, its leather cracked and faded. The drawstring was cinched tight and sealed with a brittle wax stamp that crumbled to dust at her touch. She opened it and reached inside. Her hand closed around a thick bundle of letters, tied with twine. She pulled them out into the lantern light. They were addressed to people all over the territory, in Jacksonville, in the Dalles, in Brownsville. The postmarks were from 1875, 13 years ago. This was mail that had never been delivered. She opened another sack. More letters, more parcels, all of them years old. Why? Why would a station master hide the mail? Then she moved to the crates. Using the pry bar, she broke the rusted iron straps on the first one. The lid creaked open. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, were two squat, heavy strongboxes, U.S. Army issue. She didn't need to open them to guess what was inside. Payroll, a fortune, stolen and hidden away. But it was the last crate that held the true secret. It wasn't as heavy. Inside, there were no strongboxes. There was only a thick, leather-bound ledger and one final bulging mail sack. She set the ledger aside and opened the sack. The contents were different. Not letters, but thick, folded vellum documents, each tied with a faded ribbon and bearing an official-looking seal. She unrolled one. At the top, in ornate script, it read, United States General Land Office. It was a land patent, a deed from the government, granting 160 acres to a homesteader who had proven their claim. She unrolled another and another. There were dozens of them, patents for land that had been earned, signed, sealed, and then vanished. A cold realization washed over her. This wasn't just theft, this was a conspiracy. The station master had been intercepting these patents, preventing settlers from ever receiving legal title to their land. Land that, without a patent, could be challenged, seized, and resold. But who was the station master working for? The answer, she suspected, was in the ledger. With trembling fingers, she opened it. The first pages were standard station logs, arrivals, departures, supplies. But then the entries changed. In a different, spidery hand, the true accounting began. Dates, shipment numbers, and a list of contents. 2 Army strongboxes, contents estimated $4,000. 1 sack, GLO patents, 42 total. 1 sack, private correspondence. It was all there. A meticulous record of his crimes. As she turned the pages, her eyes scanned the list of names on the stolen patents. And then she saw it. A name that made the world stop. A name that belonged to her. Patent, 160 acres, Willamette Valley Tract 7B. Issued to Ilara Braun. Her mother. The storm came without warning. A sudden, violent onslaught of wind and rain that turned the forest into a roaring, thrashing chaos. It swept down from the Cascade Peaks, tearing at the trees, hammering the patched roof of the station with a fury that felt personal. Willa had managed to drag the last of the crates and mail sacks up from the cellar just as the first gusts of wind began to scream through the valley. Now, huddled by the small fire she'd built in the stone hearth, the world outside was a nightmare of sound and fury. The ledger lay open on her lap, her mother's name staring up at her from the page. Ilara Braun. It wasn't just a story about strangers anymore. It was her story. Her family had been one of the cheated. They had earned a piece of land, a home, a future, and it had been stolen from them, buried in a cellar by a nameless thief. Was this why they had been so poor? Was this why her father had taken the dangerous logging job that killed him? Every hardship of her life suddenly felt connected to this single, yellowed piece of paper in a hidden mail sack. The wind howled, rattling the salvaged planks she'd nailed over the windows. Dust, safe in her reinforced stall, stamped her feet nervously. Willa felt a deep, primal fear, but beneath it, something else was taking root. A cold, hard anger. They had not just stolen land. They had stolen a life from her. They had stolen her past and tried to erase her future. She would not let them. It was in the deepest part of the night, when the storm was at its zenith, that she heard it. A sound that was not the wind or the rain. A shout, faint, desperate, almost swallowed by the gale. She froze, listening. It came again, closer this time. "Hello, is anyone there?" She grabbed her lantern and, pulling on her wet coat, unbarred the door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it back against the wall. A wall of rain and flying leaves met her. Out in the maelstrom, a light bobbed weakly. A man was staggering toward the station, half carrying a small child, while a woman struggled behind him. "Please!" the man yelled over the roar. "Our wagon! The axle broke! We saw your light!" Willa didn't hesitate. She waved them in, fighting to hold the lantern steady. "Hurry! Inside!" They stumbled into the room, soaked to the skin, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. The man was of middling years, the woman his wife, and their daughter no older than 8. They stared around the rustic, half-finished room, their eyes wide. "We thought this place was abandoned," the woman whispered, shivering. "It was," Willa said simply, pushing the door shut and barring it against the storm. "There's a fire. Get warm." She gave them the driest blankets she had and put a pot of water on to boil for tea. As the family huddled by the hearth, their shivering slowly subsiding, the man introduced himself. "I'm Henry Gable. This is my wife, Mary, and our daughter, Sarah." He looked at Willa with immense gratitude. "You saved us. We were heading for the coast, trying to beat the winter." His eyes fell on the objects stacked against the far wall. The mail sacks, the ledger. "What is all this?" he asked. His curiosity piqued. Willa looked from the warmth of the small, rescued family to the cold, hard evidence of the crime. She had a choice. She could keep this secret to herself, find her mother's land, and disappear. Or she could trust this stranger. She looked at Mr. Gable's honest, tired face and made her decision. "Mr. Gable," she began, her voice steady, "what was your line of work before you started for the coast?" He blinked, surprised by the question. "I was a clerk," he said, "for a surveyor's office in the Eastern Territory." Willa's heart gave a leap. She picked up the ledger and one of the patents. "Then maybe," she said, handing them to him, "you can tell me what this means." Henry Gable took the vellum patent, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read it under the flickering firelight. He unrolled it carefully, his fingers, accustomed to such documents, tracing the official seals and signatures. "Good heavens," he murmured, his voice hushed with disbelief. "This is a genuine General Land Office patent, fully executed." He looked up at Willa, his eyes sharp with a professional's understanding. "Where did you get this?" Willa gestured to the pile of sacks and crates. "They were hidden in the root cellar. There are dozens of them. And this." She handed him the station master's ledger. For the next hour, as the storm raged outside, Henry Gable sat hunched over the book, turning page after page, his expression growing grimmer with each entry. Mary and Sarah fell asleep, huddled together under the blankets. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, and the rustle of old paper. Finally, Gable closed the ledger and looked at Willa, his face pale. This is, this is a crime of astounding scale, he said, his voice low and full of awe. This station master wasn't just a thief. He was a gatekeeper. He was intercepting these patents before they could be delivered and officially recorded at the county level. He explained it in plain, simple terms. Without the patent in hand, a settler had no final proof of ownership. Their claim, while filed, remained in a legal limbo. A speculator, working with the station master, could then challenge the claim, declare it abandoned, or bury it in legal paperwork until the original family gave up and moved on. The speculator could then acquire the land for a fraction of its worth. This ledger, Gable said, tapping the cover, is the key. It's a record of the conspiracy, and these mail sacks are the evidence, undelivered, sealed proof of the fraud. He looked at Willa, a new respect in his eyes. This isn't just about one parcel of land. This could restore property to dozens of families. It could unravel years of theft. He paused, then pointed to the name on the patent he still held. Ilara Braun. Is she kin? She was my mother, Willa said quietly. A profound silence settled between them. Henry Gable slowly nodded, the full weight of the discovery finally settling upon him. This young woman hadn't just stumbled upon a historical curiosity. She had unearthed her own stolen birthright. Then you have to take this to Salem, he said, his voice firm with conviction. To the Surveyor General's office. This goes above the local land agents. This needs to be seen by the highest authority in the territory. The fear Willa had felt was replaced by a powerful sense of purpose. She had a path. The storm had brought her not just a trial, but a guide. When the storm broke 3 days later, the world was washed clean. The Gable family, their gratitude immense, helped Willa prepare for the journey. Henry helped her wrap the ledger and the patents in oilcloth to protect them. They left their broken wagon, promising to send for it later, and traveled with her, offering the safety of their numbers. The journey to Salem was long, but Willa no longer felt alone. Arriving in the territorial capital was like stepping into another world. It was a city of brick buildings, bustling streets, and men in dark suits who walked with an air of importance. Willa, in her worn coat and scuffed boots, felt small and out of place. But the memory of her mother's name on that patent was a steel rod in her spine. Guided by Gable, she found the Surveyor General's office, a grand building with tall columns and wide stone steps. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she walked inside. The main room was filled with clerks at high desks, the air humming with quiet industry. A young man with spectacles and a serious expression looked up as they approached. "May I help you?" he asked. He was polite, his tone professional, a world away from the sneering Mr. Finch in Farewell. "My name is Willa Braun," she began, her voice clearer than she expected. "I have something you need to see." She laid the oilcloth-wrapped bundle on the counter. The clerk, whose name was Thomas Reed, carefully unwrapped it. He saw the ledger first, then the stack of patents. His eyebrows rose. He picked one up, examining the seal, the signatures. He looked at the postmarked, undelivered mail sack. Without a word, he carried the items into a back office. For what felt like an eternity, Willa and the Gables waited. Finally, an older, gray-haired man, the Surveyor General himself, emerged with Thomas Reed. The older man held the ledger in his hand, his face a mask of stern fury. He looked at Willa. "Miss Braun," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "You have uncovered a rot that has plagued this territory for years. You have our profound thanks." The vindication was so swift, so absolute, it almost brought her to her knees. News traveled the way it does on the frontier, on horseback and by telegraph, passed from one person to another until it became a legend. The story of the orphan girl and the Hollow Creek Station spread through the Willamette Valley and beyond. Families who had been driven off their land years ago, who had given up hope, began to appear in Salem, clutching old claim receipts and dog-eared letters. Thomas Reed, assigned to the case, worked tirelessly, using the station master's ledger to match the patents to the families. Back in Farewell, the townspeople's whispers changed from mockery to awe. Silas Croft was seen leaving the land office one afternoon, his face ashen. He had built his fortune on some of those very lands, and now the true owners, armed with undeniable proof, were returning. He wasn't jailed. The conspiracy was too old, the station master long gone. But he was humbled, forced to relinquish claims and pay settlements, his reputation shattered. One evening, Willa saw Elias Thorne at the edge of a crowd that had gathered to hear the latest news. He didn't say a word. He just caught her eye, and in his gaze was a universe of pride. He simply nodded once. It was more than enough. The last light of a crisp autumn day slanted across the valley, painting the turning leaves in shades of gold and amber. Willa Braun stood on the porch of the Hollow Creek Station. It was no longer a ruin. The roof was whole, the windows glazed, the porch solid beneath her feet. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a beacon of warmth and welcome. The building was alive again, not just with her presence, but with the purpose she had given it. In the meadow below, 2 wagons were camped, the cook fires of 2 families flickering in the dusk. They were the first of many, people who had come to the station as a first stop on their way to claiming the lives that had been stolen from them. They looked to Willa not just as a landowner, but as a steward, the quiet keeper of a great and unexpected justice. Dust, her coat shining with new health, grazed peacefully nearby, a steadfast companion through it all. Henry Gable, who had delayed his journey to the coast to help with the initial proceedings in Salem, stood beside her, sipping a cup of hot coffee. He was leaving in the morning. "Have you decided what you'll do with your mother's land?" he asked gently. "The patent is clear. It's yours, free and clear." Willa looked out at the vast expanse of forest and field that swept down from the station. Her land, her mother's land, a place to finally set down roots. But her gaze returned to the station itself, to the light in its windows, to the hopeful campfires below. She had come here seeking only shelter, a place to hide from a world that had discarded her. She had found so much more. She had found a history that belonged to her and a purpose that was bigger than her own survival. The station was no longer just a building. It was a promise. It was a place of restoration. "I thought I bought a ruin," she said, her voice quiet but firm in the evening air. "But I found a foundation. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet courage and incredible discovery. It's a powerful reminder that true worth is often hidden, waiting for someone with enough patience and heart to uncover it." If you were moved by Willa's journey of restoring what was lost, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a story of hope against all odds. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next tale from the annals of hidden history.